the other, you know?
Perhaps. Perhaps. How you doing, Derek? JK?
Fine, thanks. Thank you. You okay?
Yeah, been doing all right.
Good.
All right, just starting up some recordings. We'll give everyone a moment to get in here. I dropped a note. I don't know, Derek, if you had anything to add, but I felt like that would be the best way to go about this, is just to kind of actually do a close reading like we do with Anti-Oedipus and kind of have that conversation that way.
Yeah, no, it's a good idea. We do that in the Being in Time reading group, and it works really well.
Yeah, it works great for AO. I think we haven't done that a lot for Logic of Sense because a lot of the stuff, I think, can be summarized because it's paragraph by paragraph. This one is just, we're starting to get into that. Cool, it's time for the meat of the whole thing, and it's a lot at once.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, good.
All right, so we'll just give everyone a moment to join up, and then we'll kick things off. We'll see what happens. Yeah. Well, maybe we'll, I'll go ahead and start. We got a few people in here, so we can go ahead and get going for the most part. Let's see, how to even start. Well, I'll start as I always do. Thank all of you for joining us on this lovely, lovely Monday morning as we dive further into the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Logic of Sense. Really excited to be able to do such a thing, and really excited to be able to continue into Orality, which is its own difficulty, its own nightmare. This is going to be a whole thing. We'll see how we get going. It's going to be fun, though. I'm excited. I don't have many announcements at this point, but I would say we are still in the process of trying to assemble all the writers and things for the Divagations Conference, putting together a website and a whole bunch of different exciting stuff. If you have anything to contribute, please, we would love to have you involved. Head over to the Divagations channel, drop us a note. We have a ongoing group helping with a lot of different writings, and we got a lot of prep and some other fun things that are coming up with that. Any other big things, Jack, for the server, or should we just start pushing forward into Series 27?
I think that covers it for me. I'll just say I'm really looking forward to this. I'm still trying to work out how to understand corporeality and incorporeality in relation to language. And this series has really challenged me on that, so I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, it's going to be a whole thing. So I dropped a note. I kind of want to handle this series, and I think going forward a little bit differently than we've been handling most of the series. Up to this point, our discussions have been mostly just discussions. We basically have pre-read, and then we do this. I think there's a lot of value here in actually going through reading paragraph by paragraph, then close reading, and spending time going through each of these points because things are starting to come back from previous series, and things are starting to show up in a lot more complex way, especially in this series, but it doesn't end here. It's going to continue for a little bit. Sexuality is difficult as well. And there's going to be a lot of pangs and notes from other readings. It's hard not to draw some direct lines again to AO or even A Thousand Plateaus or Deleuze's other work as we sort of go through this. So that's going to be the plan. I'm going to give a read, and then we will go back through each little bit so that way we make sure we're all on, generally speaking, the same page. So let me know as we go if you have any issues with that. As always, drop a note in the text chat, and that includes our viewer on YouTube. That works fine. So I'll go ahead and start reading. We'll dive through. Language is rendered possible by that which distinguishes it. What separates sounds from bodies makes sounds into the elements of a language. What separates speaking from eating renders speech possible. What separates propositions from things renders propositions possible. The surface and that which takes place at the surface is what renders possible. In other words, the event as that which is expressed. The expressed makes possible the expression, but in this case, we find ourselves confronted with a final task, to retrace the history which liberates sounds and makes them independent of bodies. It is no longer a question of a static genesis which would lead from the presupposed event to its actualization in states of affairs and to its expression in propositions. It is a question of a dynamic genesis which leads directly from states of affairs to events, from mixtures to pure lines, from depth to the production of surfaces, which must not implicate at all the other genesis. For, from the point of view of the other genesis, we posit eating and speaking by right as two series already separated at the surface. They are separated and articulated by the event which is the result of one of them, to which it relates to as a noematic attribute, and renders the other series possible, to which it relates as an expressible sense. But it is an entirely different question how speaking is effectively disengaged from eating, how the surface itself is produced, or how the incorporeal event results from bodily states. When we say that the sound becomes independent, we mean to say that it ceases to be a specific quality attached to bodies, a noise or a cry, and that it begins to designate qualities, manifest bodies, and signify subjects or predicates. As it happens, sound takes on a conventional value inside denotation, a customary value in manifestation, and an artificial value in signification, only because it establishes its independence at the surface from the higher authority of expressivity. The depth-surface distinction is, in every respect, primary in relation to the distinctions nature-convention, nature-custom, and nature-artifice. This is why I wanted to do a close reading, because there's just a ton said in there. Just to kick off, I think, not to overstate the obvious, the question here is, we have sounds. Sounds are bodies. They are the guttural noises that one may say, the phonetics of it all. How is it that from here we're able to actually get language out of that? Where is the thing which is expressed within the way that we make these guttural noises that you're hearing me say right now on this recording or live? This thing is the question. So how do we liberate sounds themselves, make them independent of bodies, and bring out language as we know it, is kind of the question that is beginning to be asked here. But please, if anyone would like to dive into a specific part, very open. Derek?
I don't think that's the question, actually. I think that was
Really?
more the question for last week. Yeah. I think this is called orality, the seat of orality. And I think what's happening here is returning to the body. So what we have previously is the event sense allows the expression, allows the language to appear. It's separating speech from sounds and language appearing, that kind of thing. I think here what's happening, it's looking at how the bodies interact with each other. It's kind of more focusing on bodies and their interaction. I think it's this is why it's to do with orality. I mean, in a sense, we could think of orality as being the opposite to language. They both obviously have a relationship to the mouth, but orality, he then talks about the notion of eating, for example, the alimentary things like that. I think this is the line that's being developed here. That's my reading anyway.
Oh.
He starts off by saying, so I think the first bit he starts by saying, I remind, and again, it's a repetition. So he says language is rendered possible by what distinguishes it. So this makes the two things are split in two.
Well, maybe I misstated a little bit then, because I don't think I'm disagreeing with what you're saying. I think it's the question is how bodies, how sound becomes detached, how sound separates out. the things we do with our mouths, the noise we make, and it forms the dimensions of the propositions. How sound does this as kind of its own unique block inside of it. The phonetics, the noise I make with my mouth, perhaps.
I don't think that's the theme of this series, though. That's what I'm trying to say. I mean, I might be wrong. I'm not absolutely sure on this, because I've kind of read half of it and I've kind of through the second half, but not. I wouldn't say I'm totally confident what I'm saying. But from my read, if you read this, so what I'm saying is that he kind of reminds us what separates speaking from eating renders speech possible, separates proposition from things renders. So this notion of separation, or he calls distinguishing it in the first sentence, is one thing is distinguished from the other. So sounds and bodies are separated. Eating is made and speech are separated. Propositions, what separates from things and propositions are separated. These are all like it's this thing to do with language in which the sense is separated from the body. So the bodies are the body is eating and things. Sorry, I don't know what that sound is in the book, but in the
I think it's JK.
In this case, find ourselves.
JK, sorry, if you can mute yourself real quick. So in this case, we find ourselves confronted with, and now he talks about the final task here. So he retraces the history which liberates sounds and makes them independent of bodies. And so it's looking at how a sound's freed from bodies. It's no longer a question of a static genesis, which leads from the presupposed event. He lays out a process which is static genesis from its presupposed event to its actualization state affairs, with expression in proposition. So there's that kind of link along the line there, which he calls the static genesis. He says it's a question of a dynamic genesis, which leads directly from state of affairs to events, from mixtures to pure lines. So there's a definite direct relationship between bodies as states of affairs, mixtures, and in the depth, to the what he calls the dynamic, to the events. So he's looking at that. I think from reading this at the beginning, I think that there is this kind of bodily structure of this dynamic interaction in the depth between bodies. I think this is what's being spoken about here in terms of orality. Not in this paragraph, but it's in the next one. It's my reading of what this is about. Obviously, I'm unhappy to be for any other view of it.
So, I mean, this is where I was. Oh, did you want to continue, Derek?
No, go.
Cool. I gotta apologize. I'm on my phone till my Wi-Fi fixes itself. But yeah, and this is why I even prefaced this with my comment. This is kind of the difficulty, is what's going on here between the bodily and the incorporeal, right? And how does language fit into that? Because I'm having my own position really challenged here. The thing I wanted to comment on is so the interesting thing about this is, as I'm reading, is there's something language does that seems to provide us something that the previous two geneses didn't, right? And that would be the logical and the I think it was the ontological were the two. One of the things that stuck out to me here is when we say that the sound becomes independent, we mean to say that it ceases to be a specific quality attached to bodies, a noise or a cry, and it begins to designate qualities, manifest bodies, and signify subjects or predicates. So right there, Deleuze seems to be saying that there's a way in which the sound is, I don't want to say freed, but sort of detached from bodies, and yet at the same time, now what that thing was, as a sound, is now able to effectively designate qualities, kind of like it had been, manifest bodies, so kind of almost seemingly like recognize them, if not create them, in a sense, and signify subjects or predicates. And you get a threefold, in a sense, structure here that he'll go into later on with the id, ego, and the superego. So the last thing I wanted to comment on was the rest of that paragraph as a customary value and manifestation, or excuse me, as it happens, sound takes on a conventional value inside denotation. So I take this to be kind of like convention and usage, a customary value and manifestation. So something like contextuality, social context especially, and then an artificial value and signification, which I thought was kind of interesting because this seems to be where some of the series comes in. Deleuze continues, only because it establishes its independence at the surface from the higher authority of expressivity. The depth surface distinction is in every respect primary in relation to the distinctions nature convention, nature custom, or nature artifice. And this seems to be the thing we need to focus on here is what's happening at the depth and surface in relation to language.
Yeah, I don't think the focus is on language. I think the focus is on the relationship between the bodies, how they interact, and the surface event. And I think what he's looking at in the previous one we looked at language. Language speech is kind of split off from the bodies, and that's what makes language possible. So he said right at the beginning, language rendered possible by what distinguishes it, separates sounds from bodies, etc. So we looked at that last week. I think he's looking now at the kind of relationship in bodies. So he's kind of going back to that kind of schizophrenic thing. I think it's in series 13. So what the bodies express in their bodily interaction, I would say. And so just, again, if we just go to the section you were just looking at, so just slightly earlier, when we say that sound becomes independent, we mean that it ceases to be a specific quality, to bodies a noise or a cry. It begins to designate qualities, manifest bodies, and signify subject predicates. So as it happens, sound takes on a conventional value inside. So he's looking at what happens in what he said last week. He said language isn't in that propositional structure. He said it's outside of that. Now he's looking at how sound actually does function within inside this kind of propositional structure, which is a kind of, he says it's denotation, says it's a conventional value inside denotation, customary value manifestation, artificial value signification. And because it established its independence at the surface from the higher authority, so it says it here, it established independence at the surface from the higher authority of expressivity. Expressivity, the event, is what makes language possible. It's saying here it establishes its independence at the surface. So it's this kind of relationship between the bodies and the surface that's being developed here. And he said the depth surface. So the previous language is distinguished, but he says now he's talking about the depth surface distinction is every respect. Primary relationship to distinctions, nature convention, nature custom, or nature artifice. So that's what I'm taking to be the theme of this series. I would say.
So for me, it's I don't, maybe we're just saying it differently because I don't think we're disagreeing drastically. The thing to me, as I would say it, that he's going for in this specific paragraph, let's not talk about the series because we haven't gone that far, is we've had the discussion about language and how language has its different elements, and it's sort of this weird generative thing about verbs and infinitives and how language is organized and what makes language possible. But before all of those things happen, because before that specific space, there is a distinction, a depth surface separation that sound goes through. There is an element in there with sound itself that enables language to even exist. The last line here, the depth surface distinction is in every respect primary in relation to distinctions, nature, convention, custom, or artifice. This is him saying sound itself becomes independent first. It's, to me, it ties into the 26 series of language, because the line that he talks through throughout that is that language comes all at once. And I think he's starting to really explain how that happens, because it didn't get explained heavily in language, that it kind of comes all at once, but sound being separated from bodies, this distinction as it moves to the surface, is what I think he's going at. At least this, again, maybe it's a slightly different reading than you, but this, like, I do take it slightly differently than it being just about language. It's much more about him talking through the dynamic genesis that leads from depth to the production of surfaces. This thing he's talking about, the depth surface thing being prior to these elements of language. This is where it starts. This is the thing that makes ultimately language possible, by this event that distinguishes sounds from bodies.
I think put in that way, yeah, I tend to agree with what you're saying. Yeah,
I think we're wording it slightly differently. But I because I agree with everything you're saying. Like, I'm not like sitting here going, well, that's not true. Like, it's, yeah, you're completely right. You're completely right. I just think I'm maybe just saying it wrong.
I think, yeah, because I think the notion of orality, I think it's not focused on speech. I think that's, for me, the key to this. This is why it goes into this whole kind of structure from Melanie Klein and the kind of baby mother kind of structure, which is endlessly not through language. It's through that kind of bodily interaction that's being expressed throughout that.
Yes, well, it's the way noise becomes voice, kind of. Well, I don't want to jump too far ahead. I feel like I'm now four or five paragraphs away from us. But to say, before we move on, to say very cleanly, the last sentence here I think is the important. The depth surface distinction is primary in relation to, and he goes through the three. The three here are denotation, manifestation, and signification. The depth surface distinction is the first thing. It's the dynamic genesis, which is a interesting phrasing for him, especially given the previous series on the different ontological genesis.
So, I mean, so the distinction, the depth surface distinction. So if we think of it in terms of the language, sound body, previously it was the sound was distinguished from the, sorry, the sound was distinguished from the body, and speech was separated from eating. So now I think he's set, this is a further distinction, the depth surface distinction. He doesn't say, he says nature convention. So he talks about the kind of relationship, the value, what he calls the value within, for example, denotation. He calls that a conventional value inside denotation. So the distinction he's talking about here is nature convention, nature custom, and nature artifice.
Yes.
Which is that question of what does that mean? I think that's where I kind of was trying to make sense of that. I mean, the way I kind of read it is that it's the kind of language. So there is language being expressed, but perhaps it's language, its structure. So within the denotation, it has a convention. It's used in a conventional manner. I don't know. I'm throwing this out there really. In what was the second one? Manifestation. I can't remember. Second one, nature custom. What he says is customary. I can't remember.
That's manifestation. Yeah,
manifestation. So there is a kind of customary element. I'm just looking at this as the structure within it. So it's prior to its kind of relationship to expression, to the event, the kind of the incorporeal event gives its meaning. I would say its kind of sense. This is what I'm trying to read it. So.
And I think we will get there, because I think where he's going with that is he's going to be getting into how we treat objects, and from full objects, partial objects, again, not to jump straight to AO, but how we treat objects, how we build them, how we understand them, and how we discuss them, like as a thing, how those things appear, this to me is where he's talking about these three, and he will get into it, maybe not directly explicitly, but I think it's coming. I do think it's coming.
Those
Yeah,
three
that-
dichotomies, those three dichotomies, nature, convention, custom, and artifice, are they like the preparations for language? Because they are like something that is, you know, representations that are, of the body, representations, symbols, signs, and so forth. That language, encapsulates, right?
Well, I think what he's saying is what sound does. It says if you go a few sentences previous to that, it says when we say that the sound becomes independent, we mean to say that it ceases to be a specific quality attached to bodies, a noise or a cry. It begins to, and he's already developed this in the previous series. It begins to designate qualities, manifest bodies, and signify subjects. He says, but as it happens, so in the moment it happens, sound takes on a conventional value, and et cetera, et cetera. I think that's what he's looking at, that absolute point there of it, which sound is detached from bodies. Before it, I would say prior to its becoming sense, it's gaining the sense from the incorporeal event, which is why I would read it at this stage.
Yeah, I'm going to say yes, and just say it does shift a little bit as we move a little further into the series. But yeah, I think that's right. It's the phrasing here that's really important is the sentence. When we say that sound becomes independent, we mean to say that it ceases to be a specific quality attached to bodies, a noise or a cry. Which is a description of the sound. That's the type of sound, or the quality of the sound. It's a noise, a cry, a moan, a groan. But at this point, it begins to designate qualities, manifest bodies, and signify subjects or predicates. This is that third step that we're talking about, the three elements: the nature, convention, nature, custom, nature, artifice. This is the shift he's meaning as sound sort of becomes independent. It ceases to be a quality attached to bodies, and that it begins to designate qualities. I can't help but be thinking about AO 33637 on despotic language and representation, where he talks through the change of mu being water, or A being water. We have the Phoenicians, they have a big sign that says water here, and it's got the letter A, for example. And along comes someone who doesn't read the language, and they go, "What's that?" And he goes, "Oh, that's water. That means water." It shifts from the sound. Like, this feels like this is him saying the same thing. It shifts from the sound being a sound for sort of its own quality for what it is, where it's just the sound also means the thing, but now we have the sound means these things. It becomes designative of these elements. There's a thing he's doing there as he talks through this that I feel is at least in line with that. That makes sense?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely makes sense.
So if anyone has questions or thoughts before I move on to the next paragraph, because I do want to try to keep moving a little bit, because this next one is, there are long paragraphs in this. So any questions or comments as I figure out how far I'm going to read into the next paragraph, because I think I'm going to divide it up. All right. I'm going to begin reading the next paragraph. Let me actually screen share the text. I'm going to read up until orality is naturally prolonged, and we'll discuss again. Now, the history of depths begins with what is most terrifying. Begins with a theater of terror whose unforgettable picture Melanie Klein painted. In it, the nursing infant, beginning with his or her first year, stage, actor, and drama at once. Orality, mouth, and breast are initially bottomless depths. Not only are the breast and the entire body of the mother split apart into a good and a bad object, but they are aggressively emptied, slashed to pieces, broken into crumbs, and alimentary morsels. The introjection of these partial objects into the body of the infant is accompanied by a projection of aggressiveness onto these internal objects and by a reprojection of these objects into the maternal body. Thus, introjected morsels are like poisonous, persecuting, explosive, and toxic substances threatening the child's body from within and being endlessly reconstituted inside the mother's body. The necessity of a perpetual reintrojection is the result of this. The entire system of introjection and projection is a communication of bodies in and through depth. I feel like that's a good place to stop and just taking a second. Or should I just continue? I'm open if anyone wants to yell at me.
Keep going.
All right. Orality is naturally prolonged in cannibalism and anality in the case of which partial objects are excreta, capable of exploding the mother's body as well as the body of the infant. The bits of one are always the persecutors of the other, and this abominable mixture which constitutes the passion of the nursing infant, persecutor and persecuted are always the same. In this system of mouth-anus or element excrement, bodies burst and cause other bodies to burst in a universal cesspool. We call this world of introjected and projected, alimentary and excremental partial internal objects the world of simulacra. Melanie Klein describes it as the paranoid schizoid position of the child. It is succeeded by a depressive position, which characterizes a dual progress, since the child strives to reconstitute a complete good object and to identify himself with this object. The child strives thus to achieve a corresponding identity, even if in this new drama he has to share the threats, sufferings, and all the passions undergone by the good object. Depressive identification, with its confirmation of the superego and formation of the ego, replaces paranoid and schizoid introjection-projection. Everything is prepared at last for the access to a sexual position marked by Oedipus through new dangers. In it, the libidinal impulses tend to be disengaged from destructive impulses and to invest through symbolization, always better organized objects, interests, and activities. For those who have been able to join us on our reading of AO, partial objects is what we were talking about here. Like this is completely what this entire paragraph about. This is early works towards it, but it's spot on and actually hits a few things that are not discussed later that I think are actually fairly important. Nice points. So with that, I'll leave if anyone wants to open up and discuss. Well, the short version. Let's start out. We'll talk about the nursing infant. Mouth, breast, begin in the depths. This idea that these things are initially bottomless depths. There is no meaning attached to them, no words, no event, none of these things. They're just simply what they are as partial objects that play inside of the space. As they become interacted, or as you may say the desiring machines connect, you may say later. But at this point, the mother becomes split into good and bad objects, aggressively fragmented. Things become separated and broken out. Bodies begin to communicate. These partial objects become essentially toxins. This aggression is projected upon them because of just how they sort of corporeally act and sort of behave, and ultimately become reprojected onto the mother's body, reconstituted and reintroduced in a continuing cycle, this over and over and over. This simulacra that is produced of this, these partial objects, these little bits here and there. Mother's nipple is part of her whole body. There's a lot of connections and a lot of baggage, we could say. There's a lot of psychological baggage when you say the word like mother's nipple or anything like that. But these elements are the simulacra that he's talking about here and has been sort of referencing. There's some really cool language in here around the bits of one are always the persecutors of the other, and in this abominable mixture which constitutes the passion of the nursing infant, the desires, persecutor and persecuted are always the same. It's an amazingly prescient way of talking about what's coming in AO, but also, I think, the rest of his surrounding work. It's a really great paragraph. Glad I just kept writing. Not worth breaking up.
Yeah, as I read it, and I don't have the greatest psychoanalytic background, but I think what he's drawing on is something like, I believe in psychoanalysis they have a terminology for like an undifferentiated whole, which relates to the unconscious, right? And I think what Klein is giving us here is a way in which differentiation is happening there, because this seems to be about the ways in which orality, mouth, and breast, initially bottom depths, right, are being split apart into good and bad object, aggressively emptied, slashed into pieces, broken into crumbs and alimentary morsels. So it sounds like a process of not only differentiation, but even, I mean, with the partiality, this almost sounds like a kind of fragmentation to me, even though these things were already in a relationship prior, right? It's not to say there's a lost whole, but there's a process in which these things are actually um, almost being constituted. As for the interjection in that, if I remember correctly, interjection is like a process of investment whereby you kind of internalize things, especially in relation to other people. That's not exactly what Deleuze seems to mean here, but it sounds like this idea of the simulacra here is basically about a process in which, um, within the depths, that which one interacts with through the bodily, right? This is still corporeality, is basically not only being, shall we say, interacted with, but it's actually being differentiated and basically invested in by the person in such a way that this process of becoming is happening to what's at play here. And I think this point about the persecution relates to the paranoiac investment.
Well, so specifically with Melanie Klein, one of the big things that a lot of people write about when it comes to her is this sort of, the reason we go to the mother's breast and the infant feeding is because to her this is the primordial sort of break that happens. Lacan greatly goes sort of down into this place. This is where lack is produced for the first time. Is a baby doesn't have any sense perception as we know it. I mean, they have everything firing off. If you can imagine, just this weird world of everything. You don't really have the ability to perceive any singular bits, and also at the same time, you just have a sort of open desire, and all you give a shit about is this immediate total gratification of whatever's happening. So your first interaction with the world that becomes satisfying is with the nipple and drinking milk. And as such, our first dealing with people that exist, the only way we can relate to someone is to relate to part of a person rather than the whole of them. There's no infant in the world who goes, yes, I love my mother. It's not how that works. No one should, create that illusion within themselves, although many do. So for Klein, this was a big deal, is this break that begins to happen. And the ability over time, as far as Klein was concerned, is that as we gain perception and things happen, we're able to, sort of build the picture of who our mother is as we're slowly learning this. Our father is, we learn through these things as whole objects rather than separate sort of parts of things. I don't think he's going that far with Klein, but that's just as a baseline. That's Melanie Klein's sort of, there is a major point. It's worth knowing because he references it, and so does Guattari quite a bit. Klein.
It was,
It seems to be two two parts to this paragraph. So he describes the first part as paranoid schizoid. Then that's succeeded by the second one, which is a depressive. So the relationship between the mother and the first paranoid schizoid relationship is one of going into the breaking up, going into the baby, then being reconstituted back as the mother. So it's a very kind of dynamic, relationship between the two. It's a very kind of antagonistic one by just reading it.
Deeply antagonistic. It's with Klein, this split. This split that happens here is where the superego gets formed effectively. So the idea being that I breastfeed over time. I start, learning my mother as a whole body over as things go. Actually, he phrases it nicely. That early part, this is the paranoid schizoid position of the child. It is succeeded by a depressive position which characterizes a dual progress, since the child strives to reconstitute a complete good object and to identify himself with this object. The idea of your subject wanting to, I'm good, I'm connecting properly, I'm doing what I need to be doing inside of the space, and what is expected of me, the complete good object, the formation of the superego. This is the identification with this object, as she talks about it.
Yeah. So the first one he says we call this world of introjected and projected, alimentary and excremental partial internal objects, the world of simulacra. Then the second one is this depressive one, which is an attempt to kind of constitute, as you say, a kind of good object. Is that the word? Yeah, a good object. There's a process of identification. So the first one is kind of taking things in, being broken up, brought in, then re-projected. It's a very kind of strange relationship. But the second one is I want to try to form a kind of a good, well, I can only say what's said here, a good object. It's he calls it depressive identification. So it's like trying to identify with something, and which he says which seems to suggest leads to a kind of Oedipal relationship with the mother. Perhaps that's what's being said.
And it's very much, well, it's the line with its confirmation, this identification with its confirmation of the superego, formation of the ego, replaces paranoid and schizo introjection projection, which is the partial object, the direct connection, the not giving a shit about the full body or anything like that. And it's all of those things happen, as they say, everything is prepared at last for access to a sexual position marked by Oedipus through new dangers. In it, the libidinal impulses tend to be disengaged from destructive impulses and to invest through symbolization, always better organized objects, interests, and activities. That last line, always better organized objects, interests, and activities. Again, the phrasing, the child strives to reconstitute a complete good object and identify himself with the object. The better organized objects, this thrust towards the better or the good and these things is... there's no mistake about that language. It's very much intentional by Deleuze here because it's a thing that is very much built into psychoanalysis. He hasn't quite met Guattari yet, but I have a feeling this is a little important to that.
And I think, as he said, and later on, a few pages later on, he'll refer to the world of six. He'll equate the thing that happens in depth, which is the kind of antagonist relation between the mother and baby. The paranoid schizoid relationship with the pre-Socratics. We had that earlier when it's the pre-Socratics is what happens at the depth, and the surface. If we remember from that surface is the figure of Hercules who goes into the depth and drags things back to the surface. But here we have a relationship between the surface, between the depth and the height almost, because then the depressive is a desire to kind of create something good or positive. He relates later. I will come to. I know I'm looking ahead a little bit, but he relates to the Platonic, which is a Platonic idea, which is something above. I think within this relationship, I think he's kind of prefiguring the depth relation between the thing in the depth, which is baby and its mother, and then this kind of psychological structure is figured within the kind of structure he's already given in terms of the pre-Socratics and Platonic, with the Stoics at the surface.
Well, and it's a push towards returning a bit, but or talking through, I suppose, the nature of this. How does he phrase it? The introjection projection of the schizoparanoiac. That is where we start, and then we move towards this identification, and suddenly those introjecting morsels are poisonous, persecuting, explosive, and toxic, threatening the child's body from within and being reconstituted in the mother's body. This perpetual reintrojection is a result of this system of introjection and projection. Is a communication of bodies in and through depth, and our move from there is towards the surface, and it's a push away from, obviously we can't just deal only with partial objects, there has to be more, but we make a leap almost towards this identification level that, as you said, is the heights.
Yeah. So I think, so this kind of, again, it's this relationship between the depth and the, what does it say? Well, he says the surface, but I think it's more, anyway, I'm reading it more as the height, because I know later on he does say the depressive relates up to the Platonic. I think this structure, the relationship in the depths is a constant one of antagonism. And,
oh yes.
And I think so in the previous paragraph, talked about, I was trying to find it, the dynamic genesis. I think if it's anything, this relationship between mother and baby and mother is a dynamic one, of dynamic genesis, I would say. It's a very kind of violent relationship, but it has this notion of dynamic genesis. It's not the other one he talked about, which is a static genesis, something that happens in stillness.
Yes, very much. And it's the static genesis posits at its core already. It's an assumption of the separation of language from bodies. Its dynamic genesis sort of is prior to that. It doesn't have the same sort of thing built into it. But we'll come back to that. That's a larger discussion. Any comments or questions on this part? Jack, please.
Yeah, I had a comment. I just wanted to focus on a brief passage. So this is regarding interjection and projection, right? The entire system of interjection and projection is a communication of bodies in and through depth. Orality is naturally prolonged in cannibalism, and anality, in the case of which partial objects are excreta, capable of exploding the mother's body as well as the body of the infant. So just to focus there, this point about interjection and projection seems to give us something of a internal external feeling, at least insofar as we're seeing how effectively, right, the child interacting with the mother, something's happening to them in which there's a internal investment, but with this projection there's something happening still external to that, right? They go on to, or getting Antidippus in my mind, he goes on to say the bits of one, so right, capable of exploding the mother's body as well as the body of the infant. The bits of one are always the persecutors of the other, and in this abominable mixture which constitutes the capital P passion of the nursing infant, persecutor and persecuted, are always the same. In the system of mouth anus or aliment excrement, bodies burst and cause other bodies to burst in a universal cesspool. So right there's something interesting here to me in terms of there's a communication going on through a changing of mixtures. And this is all going toward, right, how we're going to eventually make language, how we're going to find language in its genesis. So the interesting thing to me here is through this process of interjection, projection, there seems to be the suggestion that there's something appropriate to bodies in the way that they seem to communicate each other in this process of mixture and interaction, right? But also there's something psychoanalytic happening here, right? That's at one level we can kind of understand psychically, but at another level, it seems to relate very much to what bodies are doing to each other, especially in such a way that if we're moving into this world of simulacra, these interactions and communications, which seem to be mainly sonorous here, right? We're not at language here. Um, these interactions seem to actually be not only bursting bodies, but effectively changing and altering mixtures, right? Changing and altering what effectively appears to be relationships and, I guess to use psychoanalytic language, the ways in which these different bodies share investments with each other. And this seems to be more or less what simulacra gives us.
All right. Cool. Cool. I think I'll continue to the next paragraph with. It's a long one too. Good Lord. We'll see where I can stop. Someone type in the chat when you think I should. The comments we will make about certain details of the Kleinian schema are intended to sketch out orientations only. For the very theme of positions implies the idea of the orientations of psychic life and of cardinal points. It also implies the idea of the organization of this life in accordance with variable or shifting coordinates and dimensions. An entire geography and geometry of living dimensions. It seems at first as if the paranoid schizoid position merges with the development of an oral anal depth, a bottomless depth. Everything starts out in the abyss, but in this respect, in this domain of partial objects and pieces which people the depth, we are not certain whether or not the good object, good breast, can be considered as introjected in the same way as the bad object is. Melanie Klein herself showed that the splitting of the object into good and bad, in the case of introjection, is duplicated through a fragmentation which the good object is unable to resist, since one can never be sure that the good object does not conceal a bad piece. Furthermore, every piece is bad in principle, that is, persecuting and persecutor. Only what is wholesome and complete is good. But introjection, to be precise, does not allow what is wholesome to subsist. This is why the equilibrium proper to the schizoid position and its relation to the subsequent depressive position do not seem capable of coming about from the introjection of a good object as such, and they must be revised. What the schizoid position opposes to bad partial objects, introjected and projected, toxic and excremental, oral and anal, is not a good object, partial. What is opposed is rather an organism without parts, a body without organs, with neither mouth nor anus, having given up all introjection and projection, and being complete at this price. At this point, the tension between id and ego is formed, two depths are opposed, a hollow depth, wherein bits whirl about and explode, and full depth. These are two mixtures. One is made of hard and solid fragments within which change. The other is liquid, fluid, and perfect, without parts or alteration, because it is the property of melting and welding, the bones and of blood. It does not seem in this sense that the urethral theme can be set on the same plane as the anal theme. Excrements are always organs and morsels, sometimes dreaded as toxic substances and sometimes utilized as weapons to break apart still other morsels. Urine, on the contrary, bears witness to a liquid principle capable of binding all of the morsels together, and of surmounting such a breaking apart in the full depth of a body, finally, organs. If we assume that the schizophrenic, with all the language he has acquired, regresses to this schizoid position, we should not be surprised to find again in schizophrenic language the duality and complementarity of words' passions, splintered excremental bits, and words' actions, blocks fused together by a principle of water or fire. Henceforth, everything takes place in depth, beneath the realm of sense, between two nonsenses of pure noise, the nonsense of the body and of the splintered world, and the nonsense of the block of bodies, or of inarticulate words. That doesn't make sense. Pas de scène, acting as the positive process of both sides. Apologies to anyone who actually speaks. Looks like c'est ne pas de scène. The same duality of complementary poles is found again in schizophrenia, between reiterations and perseverations, between jaw-grinding and catatonia, for example. The first bears witness to internal objects and to the bodies they break to pieces. The same bodies which break them to pieces, the second manifests the body without organs. Whew. All right. So there's a lot said here, geez. Reading aloud this time versus last night, I'll just say this paragraph's a lot more crisp now than it was for me, I hope. I mean, maybe it's not. Maybe I've just confused myself further. But argument he's making here is this idea of the bodies and the elements sort of within it. The how to even start? How to even start? Please, if anyone wants to dive in, I'm going to compose my thoughts.
It might be useful to think about when he starts about, he says he's going to sketch out orientations only. So it might be worth to think about what he means by that. But he says the very theme of positions implies the idea of the orientation of psychic life and of cardinal points. Cardinal point, is that I think I was trying to think what that means. I think it is a thing around which something revolves. It's a kind of point which around something might revolve.
Maybe it means, how I took it to mean is that he's trying not to define things like this is what these things are, but instead giving them a here's where they come from, or here's where they're looking at the orientation of them. Because a lot of, like, one of the things, as an example, one of the things that really happens, it's a common misapplication of Deleuze's thinking in this, and also just BWO and all that stuff, is the idea that things are X, Y, or Z, which is not something I think his entire philosophy allows. But we have to talk about where things come from, where they start. And so, like, if we break down, like, the order of things, because that's where the theme of positions implies the ideas of the orientation of psychic life and cardinal points. It also implies the idea of organization of this life in accordance with variable or shifting coordinates and dimensions. That things are changing and shifting and all of this, that we have to have this conversation about orientation, not that things are always here and things are always here and here's where they go and here's the like the analytic version of this, but that we need to be talking instead about the orientations of them and where things begin and how they move and how they process. That's how I feel like what he's referring to there.
Because he says it's a geography and a geometry, these relationships. So it has a kind of location, it's located somewhere. There is a kind of angle between them. There's a kind of, it's to do with projection and trajectory, I'm not sure, but one could project, and one can imagine projection might want to think about projection in terms of our geometry, in terms of projection. You know, the way in which these things are connected. I think that's more to do with the cardinal notion, the cardinal point.
A question. He mentions, you know, the BW, the body without organs, 3 times. Could you focus in on that and explain what he means by that, body without organs?
Wow. You want us to define body without organs? Let's give it a try. I would vote that we do our best to try to keep it towards this book. But I mean, because this is a term that I think evolves significantly over time. The shift from what it is here to what it is in Anti-Oedipus to what it becomes in 1,000 Plateaus is significant. So just let's try to avoid moving through time, if I can put a little bit of a rule around that.
But maybe just in this paragraph.
I think he works towards it. I think if we develop first section, I think we come towards that because it's developed out of what he said in the previous paragraph, that idea of body without organs.
Yeah, I mean the early, so it shows up for the first time in this book, and there's previous times he's written about it, but in this book specifically, I think it's worth going back to the 13th series just for a moment, because this is where the word "the body without organs" really first appears, and it comes out in the wording around how the schizophrenic comes to dealing with the word, how he treats it. The way that BWO is sort of used here. Where do we even start? God damn it. So, let's see. Where do we want to start with this one?
I don't think it's useful to start with body without organs. I think we should, if we want, we'll just come to it if we work through this paragraph.
I agree. The stuff with Melanie Klein and the good breast, the idea of that, the idea of introjection from Melanie Klein and the movement from there and how she handles partial objects is, I think, this is part of his critique of what he was talking about in the previous paragraph, that Melanie Klein's method of believing that schizoid and projection leads directly to depressive identification, which is ultimately what yields the superego, where Lacan lack becomes introduced. And Deleuze sort of pulls back, and I think this is the dynamic genesis. If we want to talk about a thing we could even map, I think, pretty successfully, he's got a very specific sort of outline here where he starts with up front, what does it say? Everything starts out in the abyss. But in this respect, in this domain of partial objects and pieces, which people the depth, we are not certain whether or not the good object can be considered as introjected in the same way as a bad object is. Melanie Klein showed that the splitting of the object into good and bad in the case of introjection is duplicated through fragmentation. Is this sort of thing he's going through as he's talking through. But when we talk about the bodies, this line here, this is why the equilibrium proper to the schizoid position and its relation to the subsequent depressive position do not seem capable of coming about from the introduction of a good object as such, and they must be revised. This is where he starts going back to series 13 and talking how the schizoid moves through words and how they connect words through action, passion, and other things. Things start out in the depths, in the abyss, as he phrases it, but we need to have a different conversation around what causes these things to come to be. And to him, this ultimately yields this new way for us to have a conversation, or a way for us to have this genesis of these elements. And this organism that does that, which is no longer about introjection, projection, the good object or bad object, which is Melanie Klein's, for him, it's, we need organism without parts, this body without organs, without mouth nor anus, so that way there is no food or shit, there is no water or piss that gives up on introjection or projection and is complete at the price of being a body without organs. And this is, I think, his introduction. Please, Derek. And I know you. I see you coming in.
Yeah, I think I'm just developing what you're saying, because I think in the analysis leading up to where he mentioned the body without organs, he as you say, he does take that apart. He had this notion between the good and the bad object. It's as if the good object, what he's saying essentially, I think, is that the good object, to be good means to be whole, because you can't, there's no way of saying that the good object is whole. He says because it's a piece of something. Going back to the previous paragraph at the beginning, things are being split up and being introjected and then, or project, and then reprojected. I can't remember the terminology. I think essential to that is the notion of fragmentation, I would say. And he says, it also says that every piece is budding. Every piece, so the word piece implies it's a fragment. It's not a whole. So every piece is budding principle. Is persecutor. that only what is wholesome and complete is good. But he says introjection does not allow what is wholesome to subsist. So within introjection, there's nothing whole within that. So, and this is what leads him to talk about this body without organs, because as a body without organs, it's whole, it's a whole thing. This is why the equilibrium property of the schizoid position relates to the subsequent depressive position not seem capable coming from the introjection of a good object as such, and they must be revived. So yeah, as you say, he's now critiquing this Melanie Klein's position. So this is not possible for this to happen.
Yeah.
So what the schizoid position poses bad partial objects, projected toxicity, it's not a good object if it's partial. We're supposed rather an organism without parts. Therefore, it must be a whole. If it's without parts, it must be a whole. I think this is where the body without organs is coming here. So this is why, this is what I said earlier. I think it's important to read this through. I don't think you can just pick it out and just try and make sense of it. It comes out a line of reasoning. I think you have to kind of get that reasoning clear, and then I think the idea of the body without organs is clear, because it comes at the end of a line of reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
It's a body without parts. That's what he's saying in this sense. Because previously the structure was very, in terms of the depth, bodies in depth, they were being split up, constantly fragmented, projected and introjected and projected back into this strange relationship of projection and introjection.
Well, and he drives immediately following that with these two depths that are opposed. There's the hollow depths wherein bits whirl about and explode, and full depth. These two mixtures, he says, and this is, I think, a really, there's a clarity to this that I think does carry through everything else when he talks about the BWO as things move forward. You have one is made of hard and solid fragments, which change. This is the first. The other is liquid, fluid, perfect, without parts or alteration, because it has the property of melting and welding. This nature of the BWO that is all that it needs to be, this thing that is fluid and perfect on its own, versus the sort of hard little bits that are constantly switching out as to what they are. Those two things, partial objects to BWO, feel like that's a phenomenally poetic way to talk about it in my mind. It seems very crisp.
Yeah, and I think what he does, he develops this idea of the fragment and the whole in terms of excrement and urine. So excrement is something always broken up and toxic, and utilized as a weapon, whereas urine he calls it a liquid principle, capable of binding all the morsels together and surmounting such a breaking apart in the full depth of the body without organs. So again, there's these two ideas being developed out of this, and they're kind of separate, and they have very different kind of structures and things that they can do.
And then he goes on to talk about that if we have these parts, these fragments that are running into each other inside of the abyss, and then we have the fluid BWO that's kind of all that it needs to be, that it is complete, as he says, then this is why, and he says it really cleanly, if we assume that the schizophrenic, with all the language he requires, regresses to the schizoid position, we should not be surprised to find again in schizophrenic language the duality and complementarity of words passion, splintered excremental bits and words actions, blocks fused together by the principle of water and fire. There's this movement, as we talk about, and we go back to the earlier writers here, but then again later writings, when we have a hyper disconnected speech and there may not be BW, we have those broken pieces. We have partial objects that still have the duality and complementarity, because that's the thing that starts it. Like this is it. It feels like he's starting to point out, and Derek, please correct me if you disagree. He's starting to point out that this is where that genesis takes place, that we have those partial objects. BWO kind of gets formed and is complete. This is where that happens. If BWO isn't there, we shouldn't be surprised to find those partial objects. He says, henceforth, everything takes place in depth beneath the realm of sense, between two nonsenses of pure noise, the nonsense of the body and of the splintered word, one side, and the nonsense of a block of bodies or of articulate words, the one versus the other, that versus the BWO, that doesn't make sense, acting as the positive process of both sides, that element.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if I would go as far at this point. I mean, you're probably right, but I don't know if I would go as far as to say that, but
I'm probably pulling in stuff from AO there, but it just feels like he's starting to aim in that direction.
Because the reason why I say that is because this kind of what's being talked about here is the schizophrenic depth you get, and what is the relationship between the distinguish being something is now distinguished between the excremental and the urinal, if there's such a word. Oh, there is, yeah. And the liquid and the thing that's broken up, the excrement and the body without organs. So each of these say the same thing, I think, really. And it does remind me of like I say, I think he's at the moment it's just restricted to the depth and this kind of schizophrenic depth, and how these two work together. And so I'm just trying to find it. And so yeah, and he says so. It's not just right. I know you've just read this, so but I'll read it again. Just to find again in schizophrenic language. So it's a kind of schizophrenic language. But again, it refers back to Antonin Artaud language. He says this is the example he uses. Mm-hmm. He kind of, in the earlier series, he kind of contrasts with Lewis Carroll's use of language. He says at the surface, this is a language, again, of the depth of schizophrenic language. Duality and complementarity. So there is a duality between that, as we keep saying. There's also complementarity. So things kind of work together. So he calls splintered excremental bits and of word actions blocks fused together by a principle. So they're bits, but they're also fused together. They come together by principle of water or fire. So earlier he said it was liquid, it's things binding them together, but now it's also fire is able to do that. So henceforth everything takes place in depth, etc. I won't repeat. Obviously, you've read that.
No, it's spot on. And then the line that ends it: the same duality of complementary poles is found again in schizophrenia between reiterations and perseveration, between jaw grinding and catatonia. The first bears witness to internal objects and to the bodies they break to pieces, the same bodies which break them to pieces. The second manifests the body without organ.
So jaw grinding he equates with breaking into pieces, and catatonia is the body without organs. It's the body completely inert.
Yes.
Earlier he talked about, what was it? He talked about stuttering, I think, was another kind of example he used. I can't remember really in relation to what, but it's just interesting. These kind of bodily conditions keep appearing within this book.
Well, and it's the idea of, to go back to the fluid perfect mixture, we're talking about, on the two sides of one being, how to phrase it, all these pieces of things, the depth of solid fragments are opposed to this fluid perfect mixture, the fluid perfect mixture being the BWO. This is the thing. We have two effective things that are coming as part of this. Splintered noise and the inarticulate noise, I suppose. Great other way I've seen it written.
I'm just going back to the beginning of this paragraph. He talks about the geography and the geometry. And I'm just wondering if what we've just spoken about, it perhaps is the geometry. I don't know. I'm just guessing because he glanced at the next paragraph. It's the very start to another dimension. So I don't know. I'm just
we'll get to the next paragraph. I think it's time for us to move on. Any questions? Anything at this point, please? Anyone? All right, let's talk about some good objects. It seems to us that the good object is not introjected as such because it belongs from the very start to another dimension. The good object has another position. It belongs to the heights. It holds itself above and does not allow itself to fall without also changing its nature. We should not understand height as an inverted depth. It is rather an original dimension distinguished by the nature of the object which occupies it, and by the instance which circulates in it. The superego does not begin with the first introjected objects, as Melanie Klein says, but rather with this good object which holds itself aloft. Freud often insisted on the importance of the transference from depth to height, which indicates between the id and the superego a total change of orientation and a central reorganization of psychic life. Depth has an internal tension determined by dynamic categories: container, contained, empty, full, massive, meager, etc. But the tension proper to height is verticality, difference in size, large and small. In opposition to partial introjected objects, do not express the aggressiveness of the infant without also expressing the aggressiveness directed against him or her, and which by the same token are bad and dangerous, the good object as such, complete object. If it manifests the most venomous cruelty as well as love and protection, it is not because of its partial and divided nature, but as a good and complete object, all of the manifestations of which emanate from a higher and superior unity. In fact, the good object from which it extracts its force and that of the body without organs from which it extracts its form, that is, its completeness and integrity. It maintains, therefore, complex relations with the id as a reservoir of partial objects, introjected and projected to a fragmented body, and with the ego as a complete body without organs. Insofar as it is the principle of the depressive position, the good object is not the successor of the schizoid position, but rather forms itself in the current of this position, with borrowings, blockages, and pressures, which attest to a constant communication between the two. The limit, of course, the schizoid can reinforce the tension of his own position in order to shut himself up to the revelations of height or verticality. But in any event, the good object of the heights maintains a struggle with the partial objects in which force is at stake in the violent confrontation of two dimensions. The body of the infant is like a den full of introjected savage beasts which endeavor to snap up the good object. The good object, in turn, behaves in their presence like a pitiless bird of prey. Under these circumstances, the ego identifies with the good object, patterning itself after it in a model of love and partaking of its power and its hatred toward the internal objects. But it also partakes of its wounds and suffering under the blows of these bad objects. On the other hand, it identifies itself with these bad partial objects, which endeavor to catch the good object. It offers assistance, alliance, and pity. Such is the vortex, id, ego, superego, in which everyone receives as many blows as he meets out, and which characterizes the manic-depressive position. In relation to the ego, the good object as superego mobilizes all of its hatred to the extent that the ego has allied itself to the introjected objects. But it does grant it assistance and love to the extent that the ego crosses over and attempts to identify itself with it. Like page and a half, 2 pages. Derek, would you like to start? Jack? Anyone? Jack? Anyone?
It's just worth commenting, as you said at the beginning, that he's taken, usually I think this notion of good object seemed to be contained in the depth, but now he's saying the good object, it belongs to another dimension, another position. So again, I think his position, I don't know, again, I was trying to relate that, perhaps I'm forcing it a little bit in relation to the notion of geography. It belongs to the heights. puts itself above and does not allow itself to fall without also changing its nature. That height is not an inverted depth. It's a dimension distinguished by the nature of the object which occupies it, by the instance which circulates in it. That reference to instance is to do with the event of the incorporeal object, I would say. Then he goes on to now bring in these, again, these psychiatric terms from psychiatry, I take it, like superego, etc. Superego. The word, obviously, super implies above. Ego, something, ego above, does not begin with it. So he's now, again, he's objecting what Melanie Klein says. So superego does not begin with the first introjected object, as Melanie Klein says. Rather, it's good object. So it's this whole, it doesn't come from this introjected object, which is fragmented, but it comes from an object which is whole, which holds itself aloft. Again, it's relationship between depth and height, which is developed now in the next sentence in terms of Freud. So it's a notion of transference between.
Yeah, I like that. Sorry to interrupt. Please, I didn't mean to.
No, carry on.
Carry on. I don't know about that.
But I just saying. So he's talking about. So it goes from Melanie Klein. So he has this notion of height and depth, and he just says he then brings in Freud. He talks about transference from depth to height, which he then says and very little about these terms. So I'm just saying what's been said here. Depth, which I take it relates to the id, and superego relates to the height. This is total change. He says, so again, going back to the next previous paragraph, in terms of orientation, reorganization of psychic life.
Well, and it's the idea that good objects, another term we could use for those later would be representations. A good object can't be introjected because it is a complete object. Like this is, it naturally belongs, as he says, to the start, to another dimension. It has its own position. It holds itself above, does not allow itself to fall without totally changing its nature. This shift, instead of saying that there are good objects, which is where Freud very much starts, that there is a mother that's able to conceive of it, absurd, but that there are good objects. This isn't where language starts. Those are in the heights. It ends up there, and we need to sort of take a step back because that's where the superego begins. Good objects in the height, not with introjected. It's not like Melanie Klein says. We need to change our orientation. And again, uses that word a few times in here, and I think it's important as such. But the good object becomes powerful and has its setup because of partial objects. Those are the things that give it its force. They are, we were to say a whole object or a representation of the good object is it's like a paint by numbers puzzle that's been completed. All it has is the numbers and the dots, but we've drawn the lines and we've created the perfect version of it, even though it's just those pieces. Without those pieces, those partial objects from which it would extract its force, the body without organs extracts its form. Without that, it's nothing. It's this complex relations, as it maintains, therefore, complex relations with the id as a reservoir of partial objects, introjected and projected on the fragment body, with the ego as a complete body without organs, this sort of setup. And he then moves, and it's an interesting move, and switch to talking about the violence or hate or anger or the struggle of partial objects. Force is at stake, the violent confrontation of the dimension. The line he has here I love: the body of the infant is like a den full of introjected savage beasts which endeavor to snap up the good object. The good object in turn behaves in their presence like a pitiless bird of prey. The ego identifies with it, patterning itself after it in a model of love and partaking of its power and its hatred towards the internal objects. There is that natural antagonism. The body of the infant, all of the different, I'm so trying not to say desiring machines, but it's like the blob of desiring machines that is an infant, the blob of savages, as he says here, that is an infant or a baby or even a grown person, that's trying to piece this together and find this stuff. It's doing its job, but at the same time, this good object is happily fighting back, and as such, the baby begins to identify with. And this is where the beginning of that problem starts. Patterning itself after it in a model of love, partaking of its power and hatred toward the internal object. But it also partakes of its wounds and its suffering under the blows of the bad object. And this sort of calling of things, of the good and bad objects, with superego playing in it, and the identification of the ego coming out is a really crisp, interesting way of talking through what will come here in its other texts.
I think the structure is becoming clearer because he talks in the middle of the paragraph. So I've just been reading this, so I'm not sure if you read it, but he talks about the good object as being, he said the good object takes upon itself the two schizoid poles, that of the partial object. It has this kind of almost like the incorporeal event. It's almost in a sense coordinating the series, but it has almost seems similar to that. So the good object takes upon itself the two schizoid poles, that of partial object, from which it extracts its force, and that of the body of objects from which it extracts its form, is its completeness and integrity. So this good object is something that takes on these two things. And it, as he said, I think he said it earlier about the two things, they come together. Yeah, they're not separate. This good object is kind of working these two things together. But it says good object is not the successor schizoid position, but rather forms itself in the current of this position with borrowings, blockages, and pressures, which test to a constant communication between the two. It seems a constant struggle is taking place here, I would say, between the height, the depth, and the good object is the thing that's coordinating that, perhaps.
And the tension between them, let's call it the bodies as they are, the little bits as they sort of collide, and the idealized version, the BWO, and the deep tension there that exists sort of by nature of that gulf between them. And then the ego trying to identify on top of all of that. Questions or comments before I move to what I think is a couple more paragraphs. Oh God, we're not getting through this today.
So at this point, the BWO is identified with the ego. So the ego becomes kind of like this body without organs, and that's kind of, it seems like an ideal in this kind of struggle and progression, right, from the depth to the height, and that the good object is leading the ego towards these heights, right, and and arriving at the surface where the maybe that's where the superego is.
So I would just add a little bit, because I think yes, I would say the way the superego plays in here is superego identifies with, let's say, good objects, the id with the pieces, and then ego sort of within all of that identifying, and the identification is playing with the BWO. Is that fair, Derek, Jack, You're reading it? Like ego would be BWO, good objects would be superego, idealized forms, and then the id sort of plays with partial objects. In relation to the ego, the good object as superego mobilizes all of its hatred to the extent that the ego has allied itself to the introjected objects. But it does grant it assistance and love to the extent the ego crosses over to identify itself with it.
They calls it a vortex. Ego, superego relationship is a vortex. I think again a very kind of dynamic image that's been used.
Yeah, and he says very cleanly also a little earlier that the ego identifies with the good object as well, patterning itself after it in a model of love, partaking of its power and hatred towards eternal objects. The BWO kind of exists separately from these. It's not so much identifying with the ego; it's part of the process, which I think again with the way AO is written, I think follows that pretty cleanly in line. That BWO is sort of a secondary thing that's produced. Like I said, a draw by numbers that has already been filled out with the dots there. The figure as a whole is the BWO. The pieces, they don't necessarily mean that whole, but we need it's that. Okay, I know what that is. And with that, the ego comes out as identifying with the good, and is part of the superego, and again the tension, because the ego identifies, and that pisses off the superego's identification with.
Eventually, the BWO will identify with a superego, right? And in later, in the AO, would that be correct? It's like an idealized form of image of the self, or
Yes, maybe not wholly directly, like because when we start saying that these terms are sort of the same, it doesn't work as well as we get a little bit further after Deleuze sort of gets his dose of Guattari and really has a lot of his stuff torn apart, because a lot of this also doesn't really follow into Lacan either. Like this is very Freudian Klein stuff. Lacan turns a lot of it on its head. Guattari goes even further, and I think Deleuze tends to follow with that, where there's the idea of the id, ego, and superego itself is kind of outdated. So I wouldn't necessarily go that far saying it.
yeah, because eventually we're going to be coming up on this graph that's in the anti-Oedipus, maybe the next time or next week, where it shows that the BWO is the kind of like at the bottom of the triangle, which is, I guess, means that it's a totality of all of these psychological states, but it includes, the capitalist socius and so forth.
Yeah, it's the line he has, the two mixtures, and the BWO is liquid, fluid, perfect, without parts or alteration, because it has the property of melting, welding. The BWO is unique like that. I like the idea of it being liquid, fluid, and perfect. That is a great way to put it, because it doesn't have a hardened shape. It becomes what it needs to be in order to make up as a new partial object is found, or as a series of them are. Gets added to, but there's this constant sort of the ego identifying with it. There's that constant tension of that happening. That's where it starts going a little off, say. But it's the next paragraph is actually about that. I think I want to carry forward a bit. Yeah, I'm just going to read the next paragraph. We'll do this. That love and hate do not refer to partial objects, but express the unity of the good and whole object, must be understood in terms of the position of that object. its transcendence in height. Beyond loving and hating, assisting or fighting, there is escaping and withdrawing in the heights. The good object is by nature a lost object. It only shows itself and appears from the start as already lost, as having been lost. Its immanent unity lies here. Only as lost, the good object confers its love on the one who is able to find it for the first time as found again, the ego which identifies with it. And it confers its hate on the one who approaches it aggressively as something discovered or exposed, already there, the ego that takes the side of the internal object. Coming about in the course of the schizoid position, the good object posits itself as having always pre-existed in this other dimension which now interferes with depth. This is why, higher than the movement through which it confers love and blows, there is the essence through which and into which it withdraws and frustrates us. It withdraws covered with its wounds, but it also withdraws into its love and hates. It gives its love only as a love which was given before, as a pardoning. It confers its hate only as a recalling of threats and warnings which did not take place. It is therefore as a result of frustration that the good object, as a lost object, distributes love and hatred. If it hates, it is a good object, no less than it loves. If it loves the ego which identifies with it and hates the ego which identifies with the partial objects, it withdraws even further. It frustrates the ego which hesitates between the two and suspects it of double dealing. Frustration, in view of which the first time can only be a second time, is the common origin of love and hatred. Good object is cruelty of the superego, to the extent that it ties together all these moments of love and hate conferred from on high, with an instance which turns its face away and offers its gifts only as gifts offered once before. Schizophrenic, pre-Socratic philosophy is thus followed by depressive Platonism. The good is reached only as the object of a reminisce, uncovered as essentially veiled. The one gives only what it does not have, since it is superior to what it gives, drawn into its height. And as Plato said of the idea, it flees or it perishes. It perishes under the blows of internal objects, but it flees in relation to the ego, since the idea precedes it. The idea withdraws as the ego advances, leaving with it only a little love or hate. These, as we have seen, the characteristics, the depressive past perfect. Whew. There's a lot of poetry in that. So it's hard for me to break apart any section and sort of do an analysis on it. I think some of this is going to be fairly pervious to a more analytic take, because it is intended to speak to things beyond that. We're talking about transcendence and the good object's transcendence. The ability for something to be transcendent is its ability to escape into the heights, to become that lost object. This lost object, as he says, bestows love on the ego that identifies it, but it does, its anger has hate on the one identifying with the partial objects. This withdrawing from the ego, cruel giving of gifts and love, kind of comes with it. We're talking about transcendent concepts in all of this, is how I'm reading it. Not partial objects, not the bodies clashing into each other, but this other thing, these representations, that how they deal with us and how they deal with the subject.
Is he talking about the superego as the father figure who, castrates and then disappears? and is no longer on the scene.
I'll need you to probably tease that out a little bit longer.
Yeah, that's all. Well, that's I think that's the way Lacan it describes it as the castrating father that separates the infant from the mother and disappears, and it for the good object or the transcendence is this kind of the symbolic order that the infant has to manage to adapt to, to constantly, search out and try to adapt to and learn from and become part of that symbolic order. So there's a kind of, this loss is kind of the lack of the castration that occurs. It brings about this experience of lack, lack of the mother, but also the fragmentation, the the need to identify with the father figure, the superego, the superego, and but the disappearance of the father.
I think paragraph. I think it develops the idea of love. Ends up the previous paragraph. He was talking about the relationship. So he has this this what he calls the vortex of id, ego, superego, and which is developed previously in terms of the partial object and the body without organs, and the good object kind of coordinating these two. And ends previous paragraph is the relation to the ego, the good object, superego mobilizes all its hatred to the extent that the ego has allied itself to introjected objects, but it does grant it assistance and love to the extent that the ego crosses over and attempts to identify itself with it. So there is this kind of relationship between the two, how the two are coming together. Each of them, superego, has this relationship of hatred, but also one of assistance and love as well. And I think this paragraph is developing that further, I would say. So he starts off by saying, love and hate do not refer to partial objects, express the unity of the good and whole object. Sorry, that love and hate do not refer to partial objects, but express the unity of the good and whole object must be understood in terms of the position of the object, its transcendence in height. So because the good object is at height, he's saying that this is why it's able to have a relationship in terms of good and hate, or loving and hating towards the ego.
Yeah,
then he goes on. He said, but beyond, he also develops this further. So he expands that unloving and hating, assisting or fighting. So he said, loving, hating, assisting or fighting is also escaping and withdrawing. So there's six ways in which these ego and the superego, or the partial object and the good object, have this relationship. And he goes on to say the good object is by nature a lost object. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's not the so that's that kind of love-hate relationship. Isn't that the Oedipal complex that that comes about by the father figure?
I think he says that. I think he's not really at this stage. I don't think he's talking about that at all. I don't think. I mean, I think you may. I don't know.
I actually think I have I've been Googling a bit as you guys have been talking. So I will agree with, I think Jack and Derek are spot on that he's not like making a case for anything having to do with Oedipus at this point. But there is a sardonic edge to a lot of what he's saying here, because the specific terminology, especially used by Klein, but also Freud, is the cruelty of the superego, the way that the father loves but hates his son, the way that handles. I think what he's doing here in his very wry, sardonic way is trying to tease out through an example of Oedipus, or by referring back to these things to go, look, this is how you've created these representations around it, but actually we're talking about these pieces that are moving around. So when he talks about the cruelty of the superego, he says, the good object is cruel to the extent it ties together all these moments of love and hate conferred from on high, with an instance which turns its face away and offers its gifts only as gifts offered once before. That's him sardonically, like bringing up something that is related to that rather than referring directly to Oedipus at this point, if that makes sense. That's how I would read it at this point.
Yeah, if I could comment there. So the only explicit reference Deleuze will make to Oedipus in this section is that Oedipus marks sexuality, right? And then he's going to go into explaining that he's doing a complementary reading of Klein, which includes some criticisms, right? So your explanation of Lacan, I think is really interesting. I appreciate what you're seeing there, and I think that's part of why he's prefacing a complementary reading to Klein's. He, at least so far, he's not leaning too heavily on Oedipus, right? But if you know Klein and Lacan, I wouldn't be surprised if you see that here, especially since we're dealing with elements of three, right? Which unfortunately always seems to bring us back to Oedipus, right? But more directly, I think what he's getting at here with this question of Platonism and the pre-Socratics, right? He's drawing on recollection and the Meno here, right, to try and explain the manic depressiveness of the Platonism, right? So this process of investment in that, right? I don't think it's necessarily a lack; it's a recollection, right? And that's what this past perfect is giving us. There's something in the rediscovery for Platonism that is particular to it, and that does something with the superego, right? Especially since we're saying there is this kind of cruel process bound up in that, right? And I could see how that pertains to the father and castration. I think Deleuze is still kind of contrasting that, making a contrasting assessment here, though.
I think the whole thing's a critique. He's going in order of id, ego, now superego. Like I don't think JK's off. I think he's going through the stages, but I think he's doing it in a sarcastic, critical. Yeah. So you see this, but actually, what's happening? That's why love and hate do not refer to partial objects, but express the unity of a good and whole object. Beyond loving it, he starts going into all of these elements that make up the cruelty of the father, which is a core part of superego and all of that. But he's not doing it in a way that is, as he says, it's not about any of these elements as they are. This is for orientation. That's what it is. This is to orient us within these elements of how these things are produced and the sort of underlying elements. It's not the father. It's that we have the way by nature that partial objects, subjectivity, and full objects interact is through these setups. What he will come to call the three syntheses and the production of subjectivity, he's starting to tease out here, but it's him saying all that stuff that you have named and given these representations in good objects, they absolutely have done. The superego itself is its own good object. He's saying, pull back, just the nature of experience is what these things are. This is not the father doing this. Fuck the father. This is because when you have a good object and the subject comes along as an ego and begins to identify with it, that pisses, depending on how you identify. Do you identify with the partial objects? Then you piss off the good object. Do you identify with the object itself, the full perfected object? Oh, then it loves you very much. Like this is the nature of sense making and the nature of partial objects itself produces these elements. I mean, it ends with him even going back to, it flees the relation to the ego since the idea precedes it. The idea withdraws as the ego advances, leaving with it only a little love or hate. This little love or hate, these, as we have seen, are the characteristics of the depressive past perfect. Back to the series on alcoholism, porcelain and volcano. He talks through the imaginary past perfect that exists for people who are drunks. I have loved, I have seen, I have done this, I have done so many things, I have so much, I have so many things. And that element is what we're talking about here. Like those are the things where it's like, we're getting into the literal workings of language and all of these things, how these partial objects work that actually produce all of it. Does that make sense? Am I making sense with that?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it's he's developing this. The relationship between the good object and the ego or the introjected object, the fragmentary thing, and it's a relationship based on love and hate. Then he also says, obviously, escaping, withdrawing, assisting or fighting, escaping, withdrawing. So it's a kind of again, it's this dynamic relationship between what happens at the depth and what happens at the height. And just looking a bit in that same paragraph. So it gives its love only as the love which it has given before, as a pardon it confirms its hate, only as a recalling of threats and warning it did not its place. Therefore, it is therefore as a result of frustration, the good object as a lost object distributes love and hatred. This notion of distribution taking place, so it has this kind of power to distribute love and hate. Hates it is a good object no less and no less than it loves. It loves the ego, which identifies with it, and hates the ego, which identifies a partial object. It withdraws even further, frustrates the ego. So it's a very kind of dynamic and a frustrating relationship, I would say.
Deeply.
Yeah. Frustration in view of which the first time wouldn't be a second time is a common origin of love and hatred. This relationship between the one is, I mean, it goes back to the mother and baby. That obviously the relationship internal to that is this kind of idea of love and hatred, and it's now been developed further here, I would say. And then he relates it to. He says it's obviously it's gifts. It's something that's given. And I think that's the kind of relationship to language, I would say, that notion of gift. But it says schizophrenic. Then he brings it back to a kind of philosophical. So obviously a lot up to this point has been psychological, but now he brings it back to the philosophical. Well, he doesn't. He suppose he mixed them up a bit. Schizophrenic, pre-Socratic. The schizophrenic is his shorthand for the thing at the depth, which is what he says pre-Socratic philosophy is. It's thus followed by depressive Platonism. This is a thing at the height. So that the good is reached only as the object of reminiscence, uncovered, essentially veiled. One can tell you
and orientation and positionality is kind of the other part of this. It's deeply important that can't get left behind as we talk about love and hate, because it's where the ego is placed. It's the direction it's coming from. Where is the paranoid schizo position versus the upcoming manic depressive position? Where, again, when we talk about the topology of all of this, it's important to almost think of it in 3 dimensions as it's sort of moving through things, where we have the surface, we have the heights, we have the depths, we have the bodies, we have the mixtures, we have the ego, we have the elements, we have the partial objects, we have the good where are these things at in position and relation to each other as a sort of a perspectivist view of it? And these are this combination of things where everything is what is producing anything that comes out of it. That it's those perspectives are the important things. The difficult matrix of those elements and how they're sort of laid out. I want to read through the next paragraph because I think it'll be worth it. I don't think we're going to get through the rest of this section today. Oh, we might. Does everyone have an extra half hour? Because I think it'd be worth actually just getting through as much as we can today.
Okay. I'm okay.
JK? Jack?
Yeah, sure. But I just want to make a comment about Socrates, pre-Socratic philosophy, and Platonism.
Mm-hmm.
Is he saying that those ideas, Platonic ideas, are representations of a kind of a superego philosophy?
I'd hesitate there because there's something recollected here, right? And that is essential to Platonic philosophy. That's the me-know. there's a way in which we can talk about, especially with the simulacra essay and that, Platonic ideals in terms of representations. At the same time, we can talk about mixtures and effects in terms of Platonic ideas as far as being and becoming are concerned. And I think this is kind of where he's drawing it on language, because it's not that a being in relation to a mixture here has been lost per se. It's that it ties together through the superego what would ultimately be something like dialectical, right? Or for our case, is a mixture, the split, right? So love and hate can be tied together by the superego, which is effectively doing the work of a Platonic idea here. In that sense, I think that's what he's drawing on. Because the superego, at least as he's using it here, may not necessarily be a representation. And it kind of gets into convention, or at least might get into convention. We would have to go back to the first paragraph and work in the other threefold structure he laid out. But I think it implicates some of that. Perhaps it's artifice. In fact, given that
absolutely
we're
artifice.
talking about the series, it might be artifice.
It is absolutely artifice. I mean, you're talking about, so my answer would be yes, JK. I don't think he's saying it directly, but I think the right direction spiritually. Because what he's talking about is there's a move very specific from the schizophrenic pre-Socratic philosophy, which is that of partial objects, has to be followed by the depressive Platonism, the good. And it's reached only as the good is reached only as the object of reminiscence, uncovered as essentially veiled. The partial objects have connected, and then lo and behold, here comes Platonism saying, well, here's what they are. Or here's what they are, and talking about the thing in the past. It's necessary. As Plato said, of the idea itself, it flees or it perishes. It perishes under the blows of internal objects, but it flees in relation to the ego since the idea precedes it. The idea withdraws as the ego advances, leaving with it only a little love or hate, and this becomes the depressive past perfect. It's a reason that Plato phrases a great deal of his shit that way too. We have done X, Y, or Z. We had this. It's always idealized and past perfect specifically in grammar. It flows that way.
Right, but then it's not some. I still don't think he means representation there. He's talking about what has been, and with the creation of a series, the semiotics, the artifice. There's a way in which that's tying together what has been, and that provides you the idea, right? So it does connote a state of being, but it's a state of being that has been, that you access through recollection.
But it's a recollection into the heights, transcendence.
Yes,
right?
yes. Because it's recollection. Like, again, it doesn't exist within Chronos, so we're not dealing with bodies at all as they are. We're dealing with aeon if it's a recollection, or future or anything idealized. As such, this sort of take, I think, does lean it towards the idea of being that transcendent good or whatever. As there's a reason he capitalizes good when he refers to it as good inside of the book. It's reached only as the object of reminiscence, uncovered as essentially veiled. The one gives only what it does not have, since it is superior to what it. But we'll get back to Chronos and Aeon. That doesn't go away. He's not talking about it right here. Right now, he's just talking through as we move through orality specifically. But I'm going to read the next paragraph because I think we're sort of edging up against it anyway. The manic depressive position, being determined by the good object, presents therefore all sorts of new characteristics at the same time that it inserts itself in the paranoid schizoid position. This is no longer the deep world of the simulacra, rather that of the idol on high. It is no longer a matter of mechanisms of introjection and projection, but of identification. It is no longer the same Spaltung or division of the ego. The schizophrenic, pardon me, I had to mute something. The schizophrenic split is a split between the explosive, introjected, and projected internal objects, or rather the body, which is fragmented by these objects, and the body without organs, and without mechanisms renouncing projection, introjection. The depressive split is between the two poles of identification, that is, the identification of the ego with the internal objects, and its identification with the objects of heights. In the schizophrenic position, partial qualifies internal object and is contrasted with complete, which qualifies the body without organs reacting to these objects and the fragmentation they make it suffer. In the depressive position, complete qualifies the object and subsumes under it not only the qualifications armed, wounded, but also present and absent, as the double movement by means of which this highest object gives outside of itself and withdraws into itself. For this reason, the experience of frustration, that is, the experience of the good object which withdraws into itself, or which is essentially lost, belongs to the depressive position. In the case of the schizoid position, everything is aggressiveness exerted or undergone in the mechanisms of introjection and projection. In the strained relation between fragmented parts and the body without organs, everything is passion and action. Everything is communications, bodies in depth, attack, defense. There is no room for privation or for the frustrating situation which appears in the course of the schizoid position, although it emanates from the other position. It is for this reason that the depressive position prepares us for something which is neither action nor passion, that is, for the impassible withdrawal or contraction. It is for this reason, as well as the manic depressive position seems to have a cruelty which is different from the paranoid schizoid aggressiveness. Cruelty implies all these moments of a love and hate bestowed from above, but by a good but lost object, which withdraws and which always gives what it gives for the second time. Masochism belongs to the depressive position, not only with respect to the sufferings which it undergoes, but also with respect to the sufferings that it likes to confer through identification with the cruelty of the good object as such. Sadism, on the other hand, depends on the schizoid position, not only with respect to the sufferings it inflicts on others, but also with respect to the sufferings it inflicts upon itself through the projection and internalization of aggressiveness. We have seen from another point of view how alcoholism fits the depressive position, playing the role of the highest object, its loss, and the law of this loss in the past perfect. We have seen how finally it replaces the liquid principle of schizophrenia in its tragic presence. This manic depressive position, I love the phrasing of that. The idea of it being part of the height, splitting identifications of the ego with partial or complete objects, which is different than the schizoid split of introjection, projection. The complete line here, I really like, qualifies the object, assumes it not only under the qualifications unharmed, wounded, but also present and absent, as the double movement by means of which the highest object gives outside of itself and withdraws into itself. There's a lot said there in that sentence. I'm not quite sure how I want to dive into it, but it's a shitload said right there.
I think one of the underlying kind of narratives in this paragraph, and I think previous as well, is this relationship between the Platonic and the Socratic. So I think this is what the first beginning kind of talks about. So it has this manic depressive position. So the one that has both the pre-Socratic and the Platonic is determined by the good object. It inserts itself in the paranoid schizoid position. It's no longer the deep world of simulacra, of the world, that of the idol on high. Both these terms are simulacra relates to the, well, is in the depth. The idol is the thing on the heights through which towards which the object tries to conform. And the kind of Platonic, one of the things that Deleuze says it elsewhere is that the kind of Platonic system, it's purely set up to suppress the simulacra through the idol. The idol relates to the idea. And it says no longer matter mechanisms of introjection and projection. So these kind of processes of these very dynamic processes, but of identification. So the notion of identification is when you say one thing is this other thing. I think that one thing is the idol. This is what I would read it. It's no longer the same spelling or division of the ego. So the ego is not being split. And then he goes on to talk about how the schizophrenic split is split between explosive, etc.
Yeah, it's the sentence I read. I really love how crisp he phrases it, where we talk about partial objects versus complete. Complete objects qualify them and subsume under it not only qualifications that are generally opposed to each other. Right? Something can't both be unharmed and wounded. Well, actually, complete object has the ability to be either. The nature of the complete object, the Platonic sort of version of these things, the story of the heights, always has this double movement by means of which the highest object gives outside of itself, withdraws into itself. It's an extraordinary way of phrasing that I really.
I think he's developing that idea between the pre-Socratic and the Platonic in this section. So he says the schizophrenic position partial. So the internal opposite, the qualification of partial, it's kind of saying it's not complete. It's not, it's only partial. He says it's not. Whereas in the depressive position, i.e. the Platonic, complete qualifies the object, something that are not in the qualification unharmed and wounded, but also present. In the depressive, i.e. Platonic position, complete makes the object appear, really. Makes it appear. Well, it's either present or absent, either conforms to the idol or it doesn't.
And it's he also adds in the idea of frustration, which is cruelty and masochism being attached to the Platonic, which is a really he's ascribing things to the two systems of belief of how language is created and how meaning is generated. One, the Platonic, which leads to frustration and masochism, or there's the schizoid position within partial objects. It's always that of attack, defense, action, passion, sadism coming from that without privation. The whole thing. It's a really hell of a paragraph.
But I think this is part of the challenge too, right? You end up having all the Platonic stuff doing things here, right? So it's, and this is why I'm a little hesitant just to say it's representation. But this point about the idol and that, right? This is all still happening in relation to each other, right? The idol and the depressiveness are still, as he says, inserting itself into the paranoid schizoid position, right? Part of this dynamicy, it's not simply just at the depths, right? It's a dynamicy between, to shorthand at the pre-Platonic, there's your Nietzschean stuff, the pre-Socratic and the Platonic systems here, right? They're both working upon each other, and in that you get you move from terror into cruelty, it seems.
And I think what we're talking about here also is the sort of natural antagonism and frustration issues that exist in either form. Specifically within the Platonic is not really a settling of the issues. If we talk about sort of through time, as he's talking about, one leads into the other, the pre-Socratic being very schizoid. The way he's phrasing this is it's sort of the pre-Platonic, the Socratic, pre-Socratic, where it's the ideas are themselves or the bodies, and it's dealing with bodies, and there's this constant, attack, defend that's always happening because partial objects are just partial objects. When we start unifying them, which Plato and Platonic models do, we end up in this place in the heights. The issue, of course, becomes that complete naturally qualifies things as being a bunch of shit they're not, and utilizes sort of descriptions or elements, as he says, present, absent, unharmed, wounded. And so frustration naturally belongs to this depressive position. And these sort of inherent issues start happening right there. And I'm just going to read the next paragraph because I think it carries forward right from my point. And then the first stage of the dynamic genesis appears. The depth is clamorous, clappings, crackings, gnashings, cracklings, explosions, the shattered sounds of internal objects, and also the inarticulate howls, breaths, the body without organs which respond to them. All of this forms a sonorous system bearing witness to the oral anal veracity. This schizoid system is inseparable from the terrible prediction. Speaking will be fashioned out of eating and shitting. Language and its univocities will be sculpted out of shit. Artaud speaks of the caca of being and of its language. But, to be precise, what guarantees the first rough sketch of this sculpture and the first stage in the formation of language is the good object of the depressive position up above? For it is this object that, from among all the sounds of the depth, extracts a voice. If we take into consideration the characteristics of the good object, being found only as lost, of appearing for the first time as already there, it seems that they are necessarily gathered into a voice which speaks and comes from I. Freud himself stressed the acoustic origin of the superego. For the child, the first approach to language consists in grasping it as the model of that which pre-exists, as referring to the entire domain of what is already there, and as the familial voice which conveys tradition. It affects the child as a bearer of a name and demands his insertion even before the child begins to understand. In a certain way, this voice has, at its disposal, all the dimensions of organized language. It denotes the good object as such, or, on the contrary, the introjected object. It signifies something, namely all the concepts and classes which structure the domain of pre-existence, and it manifests the emotional variations of the whole person, the voice that loves and reassures, attacks and scolds, that itself complains about being wounded, or withdraws, keeps quiet. The voice, though, presents the dimensions of an organized language, without yet being able to grasp the organizing principle according to which the voice itself would be a language. And so we are left outside sense, far from it, this time in a pre-sense of heights. The voice does not yet have at its disposal the univocity which would make it a language, and having unity only in virtue of its eminence, rests entangled in the equivocity of its denotations, the analogy of its significations, and the ambivalence of its manifestations. Truth to tell, to the extent that it denotes the lost object, one does not know what the voice denotes. One does not know what it signifies, since it signifies the order of pre-existing entities. One does not know what it manifests, since it manifests withdrawal into its principle, or silence. It is at once the object, the law of loss, and the loss itself. Indeed, as the superego, it is the voice of God, that which forbids without our knowing what is forbidden, since we will learn it only through the sanction. This is the paradox of the voice, which at the same time marks the insufficiency of all theories of analogy and equivocity. It has the dimensions of a language without having its condition. It awaits the event that will make it a language. It is no longer a noise, but it is not yet a language. We can at least measure the progress of the vocal with respect to the oral, or the originality of this depressive voice in relation to the sonorous schizoid system. The voice is no less opposed to noises when it silences them than when it itself groans under their aggression or keeps the silence. We constantly relive in our dreams the passage from noise to voice. Observers have correctly noted how sounds reaching the sleeper were organized in the voice ready to awaken him. We are schizophrenic while sleeping, but manic depressive when nearing the point of awakening. When the schizoid puts up a defense against the depressive position, when the schizophrenic regresses beyond this position, it is because the voice threatens the whole body, thanks to which it acts, no less than it threatens the internal objects through which it suffers. As in the case of the schizophrenic language student, the maternal voice must be decomposed without delay into literal phonetic sounds and recomposed into inarticulate blocks. The thefts of the body, thought, and speech experienced by the schizophrenic in his confrontation with the depressive position but one. It is not necessary to wonder whether echoes, constraints, and thefts are primary or only secondary in relation to automatic phenomena. This is a false problem, since what is stolen from the schizophrenic is not the voice. What is stolen by the voice from on high is, rather, the entire sonorous pre-vocal system he was able to make into his spiritual automaton.
And see, this does kind of make sense to me too, because even with the Platonic, right, one of the things with the past perfect is the has been, the had been, right? You're using a helping verb to modify a verb, right, and typically to connote the past. But I like that he's drawing on Chronos here, because I think that's right, because when you're referring to it has been, I don't know, it has been loved, it has been hated, right? There is still a way you're talking about the present in that. And this idea of God here in the voice, I think, is particularly helpful because it suggests that we're bouncing up again, if you like. We're broaching the limit that God sets or Zeus sets, however you like, for Chronos, right? It almost suggests to me like you're hitting up against the eternal return here, that kind of circularity of Chronos.
I think this is this final paragraph is really amazing. I think so. He's putting, as we've already said, is kind of looking at the role of the bodies in the formation of language. He stops before language is formed, and so he talks about the voice. The voice is the thing that prior to the expression, a sense intervenes and creates language. I think it's really interesting. So he says it's a kind of, he calls it the first rough sketch of this sculpture. So this speaking with fashion out of eating and shitting language, and university with sculpted out of shit. To be precise, what guarantees the first rough sketch of sculpture, the stage of formation, it calls it the first stage of formation of a language, is a good object of the depressive position up above, which is this voice that from among all the sounds of the depth extracts a voice.
It's I mean it's a phenomenal fucking paragraph. I mean it really is. I'm having actually trouble not just rambling forever about it. We're talking about the first stage of the dynamic genesis here, and we have the heights and depths. We have the bodies cracking, gnashing. Like I love this visual in my head as he says it, and the body without organs that responds to them. And this begins essentially with a good object from the depressive position up above, for it is this object that from among all the sounds of depth extracts a voice. You almost see the idea, the good object, reach down into the depths in order to pull a voice out of it.
Right.
It's just an amazing visual to think through it, this idea of that, followed by his explanation, as he says, that all of these things it's about model of what was already there. That is what the voice is. And it's completely true for a child. The first approach to language is a model of that which pre-exists, referring to the entire domain of what is already there. It's a completely crisp way of talking through it. And continues on that as like this weird organizing principle that eventually creates a language sort of out of this. But we're talking at this point sort of pre that there's this element that exists between these things prior to sense generation. I love this.
But he's
And he says that the voice has at its disposal all the dimensions of organized language. So the first one he talks about in terms of the annotation and its signification, and so he says it denotes the good object as such, or on the contrary, the introjected object, it signifies something, namely all the concept and classic structure of the domain of pre-existence, and it manifests the emotional variation of the whole person. This is a kind of pre-language. Voices can do all this. It's kind of developing on from what we said previously. The voice, though, presents the dimensions of an organized language without yet being able to grasp the organizing principle, according to which the voice itself would be a language. We're left outside sense from it this time in a pre-sense of heights.
But he also says that the maternal voice must be decomposed without delay into literal phonetic sounds and recomposed into inarticulate block. So he's bringing in the idea that the voice may have been given by the mother, but it's the next step is the father figure coming in, right, to introduce the symbolic order, of the height of the superego. So that ties in with the idea of the manic depressive, right? I think it correlates with the maternal voice, but the schizophrenic aggressiveness, is the is the next step, which is the instead of masochism, it has to take on this role in terms of sadism, the aggressive, schizoid position.
Inspired by like all of you, like from this part, I think like Deleuze is trying to embrace, or like based on the existing Platonism, like idea of a Plato. So the point is that here, in a way, like it's kind of embracing the idea of Plato. At the same time, Deleuze is challenging against that. I would like to pick up the point of the Brooks and the other people, like to the genesis of something new, like because we can focus on the difference between like noise and then voice and language, all of things here. I think in a way Deleuze is like focus on the noise or clamors in the depth. Even though he brought like the height here as a kind of symbolic image of Plato's idea, but I think he's focusing on like the depth, clamors. I mean, unformed like pre-voices. If I use the word at the end of the chapter, that would like generate something new, like not the existing voices, but the some voices from the depth, and then it's not formed yet, but it can be something at the end of the day. And then he trying to something vague, something unclear for me still now is that how he like differentiated between those voice and then language in terms of orality. But the point here, clarification or manifestation or representation, all kind of language, I think he in a way like can't deny the existence of idea of Plato, but at the same time he tried to throw some kind of a possibility of a hope or things like that. From the depth we can make something from the depth of clamors of death.
I actually think I think, yeah. So let me try to say it a different way, because I'm going to try to rephrase, because I'm rereading this last bit. I don't think Deleuze is saying that there is no idea plateau or whatever. There's no place for ideas, and that it's not bodies. I think what he's talking about is here, if I'm rereading this last part right, what he's trying to do is he's trying to break apart where sense is made, to talk about that it's not within ideas, and it's also not within bodies. Again, to kind of go back to one of the running themes through this is, where is sense made? If we just have the bodies, or if we just have the two, or if we just have those two, just bodies and ideas, you still don't have it, because you still have you have the bodies on one side that are clamoring, making their noises. You have the ideas on the one side pulling out a voice. You don't have language yet. Not yet. The example he gives of the child as he talks through it, I think you could make akin to a GPT-3 AI program that is able to utilize and has a voice, for sure has a voice. It's able to utilize pattern recognition and some level of ideas that are pulled out of it, but it's not sense making in the same way that we are doing through the use of proper language, through the use of things. The voice has ultimately the dimensions of the language, but not the organizing principle that makes it language. And that's sense. But his phrasing here, I had to go look it up because it's from Bergson. I assumed it was, I just had to make sure. We constantly relive in our dreams the passage from voice to voice. Observers have correctly noted how sounds reaching the sleeper were organized in the voice, ready to awaken him. If you've ever had a dream where what is waking you up somehow finds instantiation through something that makes sense to you, that was organized, which is fucking weird when it happens. Like the words someone's yelling at you that take place inside of whatever fantasy brain dream thing you've got. These things are ready to awaken you. You're coming out of it almost as if in that moment it was determined you were going to be waking up. Bergson writes a lot about this in, Spirit. What's it called? Up again. Need to get Lou in here, badly. But this idea of those elements, this organizing principle, is I think what he's driving back to, that the voice has a unity, but the unity exists only through its like eminence. We have our significations, we have ambivalent manifestations, and these elements, equivocal denotations, as he's talked about. But the voice denotes the lost object, but is not yet univocal and awaits the event to make it a language. So it's a critique of both Platonic and pre-Socratic, but talking about how even them together, there's still essences missing. It's a critique of the overall thing, which is a takedown of psychoanalytic. Like, this is 100% aimed at it. I still have to think so, especially as we get through this, that we're talking about this pre-vocal systems, as he phrases it, or it is not necessary to wonder whether echoes, constraints, and thefts are primary or only secondary in relation to automatic phenomena. This is a false problem, since what is stolen from the schizophrenic is not the voice. What is stolen by the voice from on high is, rather, the sonorous pre-vocal system he was able to make into his spiritual automaton. The fact that he becomes completely shut down and catatonic. Not that his voice was stolen. It's the voice actually stole from him.
I think what's stolen is the entire sonorous pre-vocal system, so that which enables the voice to appear.
Yep.
Which is this what he calls the dynamic genesis between the body, the depth, and the height.
Yeah. So the stages of this development, has to go through the mother, the voice, and then there's the father also stepping in, right, to kind of like point the way towards the height, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so but it's only it can only achieve this kind of level of voice sound, the notion of a culture and custom and so forth and aesthetics, but or artificiality, but it doesn't really acquire a language yet. But it is towards aiming towards the height of you know that he kind of compares to Platonic philosophy as a kind of a transcendence, but it's an infantile form of understanding of what the you know what the self is, right?
Seems like it, yeah. Any last thoughts or anything before we head out? Because it's, I mean, I have a ton to digest now. This was a wonderful reading. As always, thank all of you. You genuinely help push my understanding in ways that are fucking with my head all the time.
A lot of food for thought. I think I'm just going back to the end of this paragraph. I think the focus is on the schizophrenic, and he says, and its confrontation with the depressive position. I think that's the kind of key. The kind of his focus on the schizophrenic, and which I take perhaps is Artaud. Is confrontate the depressive position of the Platonic, which is the idea. As we just said, he said what's stolen in this confrontation is not the voice, but the pre-vocal system. Sorry, that's all I wanted to say, just to kind of clarify for myself, really. That's really good. That's really a lot of work there. So,
well, and it's worth mentioning Kent, who popped in just very quick because he couldn't help it. Dove into and linked to a handful of things around synchronicity, synchrony demonstrated between movements. And he copied and pasted wonderful section from the tipping point, which a lot of different issues with the authors, but the section's great, and it's about how there's this really weird thing that happens when people or primates, actually some other animals as well, when they're communicating, there's sort of a natural continuous rise in tone and everything, how things become harmonized in the discussion, which we've all experienced. We've all seen it happen. And the way that we modify our speech when we talk, these things are pre-language, they're pre-elements, and it's a deeply hardwired part of us. The speech rate, just to read. So what is known as latency, the period of time that lapses between the moment one speaker stops talking, the moment the other speaker begins. Whom people may arrive at a conversation with very disorient conversational patterns, but almost instantly they reach a common ground. And it's a very strange phenomenon within that. It's a great link. It's worth reading. Thanks for that, Kent.
Yeah, I'd just like to mention that the article that I put up at the first, which is synchrony demonstrated between movements of the neonate and adult speech. After what he did is he took pictures at a high rate of conversations and then noticed how people were synchronizing during the conversation. but then he focused on a baby that was in the room when other people were having conversations, and noticed that the baby's body was moving to the different parts of speech as the conversation went on. But what was interesting about it is that different parts of the body would move to different parts of the speech, and it would change what part of the body of the infant was synchronizing with what parts of speech of the speaker. And so I think that that shows that language is very deeply embedded. It's not like language appears at a certain point, but probably this kind of synchrony happens even in the womb.
Yeah, that's why they associate great music, with native development, right?
Love it. Thank you guys very much. I am going to top us out here because this is not the longest series we've done on this, but it's completely worthwhile. I can't believe we got through the whole section.
It was well worth it. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Brooks.
Thank everyone. This is great. And